So I'm going to be talking to you about cultures that are used in cheesemaking. I was able to confer and broaden my education on this by getting a grant from the Daphne Zepos Teaching Endowment, specifically the Daphne Zepos Teaching Award. And the Daphne Zepos Teaching Award was set up to remember the legacy of Daphne Zepos, who is one of America's foremost cheese educators, cheese advocates, and also she is a cheese importer. She inspired a whole lot of mongers throughout the industry, many of whom that have elevated themselves into much higher positions over the years. Daphne unfortunately passed back in 2012. Some of the things that she helped start were founding Essex Street Cheese, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and the San Francisco Cheese School. And she also helped provide scholarships for not only myself, but as of now, 10 other cheese professionals for the DZTA and 3 cheese professionals so far for the DZRA, which is a sister scholarship to the DZTA that was founded in 2021. So tonight I'm going to give you a microbial state of the union. This is a primer on the history, uses, and possible future of cheese microecology. I gave this presentation first in 2016 at ACS in Des Moines, and I've given it a number of times since then, since that first presentation, and I always love talking about it because this whole project started because I was just a monger on the counter thinking about, well, we're talking about terroir and we're talking about the milk that we're using, and we're talking about all these things that make American cheese unique from their European counterparts. And I thought to myself, well, what about the cultures? Those are kind of the building blocks of cheese. And if you look at any cheese label, you're going to see 4 ingredients. You're going to see milk, you're going to see salt, you're going to see cultures, and you're going to see enzymes. And I really want to know why we selected some of the cultures that we did, why certain producers and associations like Comté, Gruyere, Emmental derived what was culturally important to them at a microscopic level. So let's talk about what cultures are. So what are starter cultures? Cultures used for cheesemaking are either single strains or mixed strains of microorganisms, primarily bacteria, that convert lactose into lactic acid, which helps ripen the milk, making it more suitable for coagulation. In this mix can also be yeast and fungi that can help with future flavor and rind development. In the beginning, there were many microbes, and they were found all over the place. They were found in the land, they were found on the animals, and they were found, most importantly, on human hands. Human intervention is probably how we were able to get a lot of the microbes to interact with the milk that we derived from the ruminant animals that we turned into milk. They were primarily selected over time, naturally, mostly by environmental factors, the cheese-making process, and the tools used to make cheese. Prior to modern sanitary standards, there was a lot of wood, there was a lot of clay, so basically very porous materials that would allow for cultures to either be adhered or to kind of get absorbed into their into the structure of, like, whether it be a clay vessel or like a wooden cheese making vat. And for a long time, nobody really knew what was going on and why milk was coagulating and acidifying and turning into cheese. However, this all changed once we get into the 17th century. Got a couple of guys, Robert Hooke, who was part of the English Academy, and Antony von Leeuwenhoek. Both of these guys were basically like scientists. They were peers of Isaac Newton, to kind of give you the time frame, that were dealing with. The best corollary I found is these guys were the guys that had GoPros of the 17th century. So, if you've ever seen a video of a guy like jumping out of an airplane and like, they're falling towards the earth with a first person point of view, these guys were those guys, but they were using microscopes and instead of video recorders. And this image right here is a drawing that Hook and Leeuwenhoek drew of mucor during this time period, and they noticed like these like little flowers on stems, and this is what it looks like under a modern day electron microscope. So you've definitely got the stem and the spores that are falling off that. So this obviously produced a dramatic change in thinking. And for me, the best analogy that I can give for this change in thinking is Star Wars. So if we think of the first Star Wars movie, A New Hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi says that the Force is an energy field that binds the universe together. And this could be translated into, we get the cheese because of angels or maggots or spontaneity, maybe a chemical reaction. And then you have the Phantom Menace come around, and we get a much more detailed understanding of what the Force is, and that's midichlorians or microscopic symbiotes that enable our knowledge of the Force. And this, of course, translates into acidification and coagulation happen because of very small microorganisms that are invisible to the naked eye, but man, are they important. So definitely a world-changing point of view. And I know that as cheese professionals, we have an affinity and a love for our raw milk cheeses, and the word pasteurization can sometimes be demonized and seen as a dirty word, but I like to remind people that Louis Pasteur is not necessarily totally a bad guy. He advances germ theory, which is really important, especially as we're talking about hospitals and overall health. He helps advance the field of microbiology by leaps and bounds. But he also develops pasteurization that helps kill off many unwanted pathogens and spoilage bacteria in food. Pasteurization, for those of you that don't know, was initially developed to help the wine industry to combat the bacteria that were growing in wine and turning it all into vinegar. So, but this leads to kind of a talk about industrialization, and you really can't talk about how we derived microbes for modern day usage without talking about the advent of industrial cheese making. So in the 19th century in particular, there was a strong push towards industrialization following the Industrial Revolution. The first cheese factory, for example, was built in Switzerland. And when I say cheese factory, I mean like kind of what we think of in terms of a modern, food processing facility. They were pooling milk. They were cranking it out. They were using the most advanced methods. They weren't doing this, what you see, doing it on the mountain over a fire with a copper pot. In the 1840s, Joseph Harding, who is an English agriculturalist, he goes around and collects what would essentially become the most reliable methods for making cheddar. He develops the Harding method for cheddar making. And he shares this to anybody that will listen. And one of the people that did listen is a guy named Jesse Williams, who built the first cheese factory in America. And unlike the Swiss counterpart, it is massively successful. He builds this cheese factory in upstate New York in the town of Rome. And he begins by pooling the milk from 10 of his neighbors and making cheddar cheese. And it is just vastly successful. They utilize the Erie Canal to transport their cheese to markets in both the burgeoning Midwest, out where you guys are in the Pittsburgh area and Ohio, and also going down the Hudson River towards New York City and beyond. And then the big thing that really kind of makes the next leap of cheese is commercially made rennet. This is introduced to the market in the 1870s, and rennet, was one of those things that you had to do if you're a cheesemaker. You had to make rennet so that you could coagulate the milk, and a lot of people either didn't like doing it or they weren't very good at it. So having somebody that took that job away from them and was able to make more consistent and reliable versions of this pretty vital ingredient for cheesemaking was a pretty big deal. And the guy that did that is a guy named Chris Hansen. You may be familiar with him. CHR Hansen is one of the dominant culture houses and biotech companies in the world. But they initially started as a small Danish company. Chris Hansen started as a pharmacist in Copenhagen, developing peptides for the dairy industry, and these would help basically cleave through lactose and protein strands that were found in milk, helping them become a little bit more suitable for cheese and other dairy production. He built his first rennet production facility in 1874 in Copenhagen. He goes from basically zero to over 1 million pounds of cheese being made in 3 years throughout Europe. That's pretty huge by 1877 standards. All using his rennet. He is so successful that he decides to build a factory in Little Falls, New York, in 1878 to take advantage of the American market. And he chose Little Falls, New York for pretty much the same reasons that Jesse Williams chose his part of upstate New York, because of access to the Erie Canal and being able to get his product both out to the Midwest and throughout the Northeast and New England. And after he develops rennet, he's a scientist at heart, and they developed this culture called the lactic ferment. And the lactic ferment was initially a butter culture. This was developed by them in 1893. As cheese professionals, you're all pretty familiar with cultured butter. We've got Vermont Creamery, we've got Highland Farm, we've got all these, and also the stuff from France, Rudolph Le Meunier, and other places that are doing a wonderful traditional dairy product. And one of the byproducts of this industrialization is developing a culture to help ferment the cream for butter production. Eventually, he starts including these cultures with rennet purchases, and this is just to kind of increase his hold on the cheese and dairy market. So this is a timeline I developed way back in 2016 for my presentation. 7000 BCE is the first, record from an archaeological perspective that we have for cheese making. It isn't until almost 9,000 years later that we have a commercially available culture for sale. So pretty much for 9,000 years, cultures were not a necessary ingredient. And there are lots of reasons for this. Pasteurization hadn't been developed. There was a lot less consideration for sanitation. There wasn't any refrigeration, and so microbes were able to run a little more freer than they are currently. Another person that I think we need to speak about in regards to cultures and microbiology and kind of their proliferation in modern dairying is a man named Joseph Lister. He was an English scientist. He primarily was known for his work in helping to sanitize hospitals. He proves that bacteria are responsible for acidifying milk used for cheese. He also develops a method to isolate pure strains of bacteria. So Prior to this, it was just a jumble of microbes that were used for culturing milk and other dairy products. But he's rewarded for his hard work by having Listeria named after him. So kind of a, thank you very much. One thing that I found interesting in my research was that I was able to read a digital archive of a USDA manual from 1908, and they talk about these different cheeses from throughout the world and how they were impacting the U.S. dairy market and cheese market, and they listed place of origin and the ingredients, and they talk about rennet, they talk about milk, they talk about salt, they don't talk about cultures at all. So cultures as a cheese making ingredient are still a little foreign for most cheesemakers at this point. And pasteurization really still is not widely adopted by most cheesemakers, foreign or domestic, until the onset of World War I, and it is further embraced after World War II. So in 1893, as we said, the lactic ferment is introduced. In 1916, a mixed culture known as Flora Danica is introduced to the market. This is Latin, translates to the Danish flower, and it's still in use to this day. But first, I'd like to kind of talk about why do we even need cultures, and it all can be traced back to butter, which is part of the reason why the lactic ferment was one of the first cultures developed. In the 1880s, the taste for butter, in England especially, had gotten so large that they were importing it from wherever they could get it. And the Danish were more than happy to supply this demand. But as they skimmed the cream to produce butter, you actually removed a very vital barrier against pathogenic incursion. And so they needed to start pasteurizing their milk. So if they didn't have to start pasteurizing their milk, they wouldn't need to add cultures to make cheese. And it just continues snowballing and just solidifies industrialized cheese making. Oops, there we go. Whoa, why do I have doubles? Okay, sorry. But the Flora Danica, developed and released in 1916, is still used today. It's been cleaned up and modified very little. Cheesemakers, especially Alpine cheesemakers, makers of tomes, they're still using this. And it's got a little bit of everything. Some people will use it for like 80% of their makes, and then they'll use other cultures for just a little bit of microbiological diversity and to prevent phage from developing in their vat. And just because a lot of people don't know what phage is, bacteriophage. Phage is a virus that attacks bacteria. It will basically attach itself onto a cell and replicate within the cell and basically burst out like alien and destroy the cells. And that's how you end up with dead milk. And if you end up with dead milk and if you end up with phage in your vat, it becomes very difficult to cleanse your vat and get rid of it. You usually need to go through probably about a month to 2 months of no production, just trying to reset your vat and make it a place where bacteria can thrive and grow. So now we're going to talk about the main microbial types. And there are basically 3 primary groups of bacteria that are, involved in modern dairy. There are the thermophiles, there are the mesophiles, and the psychotropes. I'm kind of breaking these down by their temperature preferences. So thermophilic bacteria, as the name might imply, are heat-loving bacteria. These thrive in temperatures of 104 to 140 degrees, but can tolerate higher temperatures. they're used primarily as acid producers in the cook phase of high temp cheeses, such as mountain style cheeses, so your Gruyères, your Comtés, and Italian hard cheeses like Parmigiano Reggiano, Asiago, and Montasio, for example. And a lot of thermophilic bacteria are actually pretty symbiotic. The Streptococcus thermophilus and the Lactobacillus, whether it's Helveticus or Bulgaricus, they will just vibe off of each other and like replicate and feed the other one what they need based off of how high or low the temperature is, and they'll just drive a lot of acid production in the cook phase. The next group is mesophilic bacteria. These are bacteria that like the middle ground of temperatures. They thrive in temperatures of 78 to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, basically body temperature, but they can reproduce pretty effectively at temps as low as 53 degrees Fahrenheit. A good example of this is with Comté production. So if you've ever been to a Comté producer, you know, the milk producers will basically hire a cheesemaker, a fruitier, and then that will in turn be sent off to an affineur like Marcel Petit or Rivoire or any of the others in the Jura and Comte Franche region of France. But basically what they'll do is each milk producer will hold their milk at about 52 degrees, and this will ensure that the good lactic acid bacteria that are basically mesophilic can develop and thrive and basically jumpstart the cheese making once it gets to the fruitier. This group of bacteria is the primary driver of acidification in all cheeses, and they are the most responsive category of lactic acid bacteria in the dairy world. They produce a rapid influx of acid to help combat spoilage and pathogenic bacteria. And basically mesophilic bacteria are half the reason why cheese is a safe food to eat, for one that's derived from a raw material that can be so susceptible to pathogenic incursion. But because we're in the modern era, we need to talk about psychotrophic bacteria. And unfortunately, these are the most common bacteria in all of the modern dairy world because they thrive in temperatures of under 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And most dairying operations, Shelburne Farms included, and you know most other cheese producers that I know will hold their temperature, their milk in a bulk tank at 41 degrees or lower. So they've just become a form of modern dairy bacteria in dairy, and they're, you know, because of the temperature, they're out competing the mesophilic bacteria, which could be more beneficial for cheese making. There are some beneficial members of the psychotrophic bacteria group, and those are leuconostics, but they are not really acid producers in the way that their mesophilic counterparts are. So they're not producing enough acidification to ward off pathogens like Listeria monocytogenes and other pathogenic bacteria. So now we know about acidifying bacteria. What is going on in our milk? In modern dairy, useful lactic acid bacteria accounts for less than 1% of microbial activity in modern milk. But the small amount that is there is really crucial for future flavor development. And though modern dairying is much safer than a century ago, the trade-off is that even raw milk is too clean to promote proper timely acidification for most cheesemakers. So, you know, modern cheesemakers need to add in cultures. You know, cheddar in today's day and age is about a 7 to 8 hour process. In a traditional, you know, pre-industrialized cheddar production period, and it was a 12-hour day. You know, you'd start with your milking in the morning, and then it would continue slowly throughout the day. But because, you know, time is money, you want to make as much product as you can in a short amount of time. So this means that we are forced to rely on cleaned up commercial cultures to provide the majority of acid production in modern cheese making. And by doing that, we're really reducing biodiversity. So the main process for identifying microbes has really advanced, particularly over the past 20 years or so. Prior to that, it was a very labor-intensive process involving observation and testing that would last for months and sometimes years. And as more substrains were discovered and identified, visual observation became much more and more difficult. Rods of bacilli and little round shapes of cocci kind of all look the same at a microbial and microscopic level. So having machines like the one pictured here really help make things go a little bit faster. And these machines that have been developed can now do testing and analyze as many as 5,000 samples per hour. So it's really changed the game. And what this machine does is essentially spits out a genomic code that is based off of a database that's been compiled for decades, and it's now been broken down into this kind of genetic shorthand. But if we've got more or less all of the tools that we need, what are we doing, and why do we need to continue to find new cultures? The most research that is being done right now is being done by large-scale customers. So think your Emmys, your Lactalis, your Savencias. They're the ones that are basically paying for a lot of the research that is being done for microbial discovery. And what they're looking for are bacteria that can provide rapid acidification, flavor enhancement, phage prevention, antibiotic resistance, and effectiveness against yeast and mold. I just read an article maybe a couple of weeks ago about how Chris Hansen has developed a new strain of bacteria that can shorten the acidification window for cheddar production from 8 hours to 4 hours. And that is like a huge development because you're essentially cutting your labor time in half to get similar results. It's still in the testing stages, but they have found or developed a strain that can pretty much do twice the work in half the time. There's now a database that is loaded with known genetic sequences from all over the world, and that's how they're able to determine what is available and what is new in terms of these microbes. So we're going to talk a little bit about how other countries kind of interact with cheese and the cultures that are vital for making some of their iconic cheeses. The Swiss are the makers of some of the longest continually produced cheeses in Europe. The benefit of being this little mountain fortress in the middle of Europe. They also started progressive agricultural research programs in the late 19th century. And there was a university that was primarily behind this, and this would in turn become Agriscope, which is the Swiss National Laboratory for Agricultural Diversity. And they'll do everything from cheese culture investigation to stuff for wine and wheat and other vital crops to the Swiss economy. But after World War I and all of the strife that they were seeing in the rest of Europe, they decided to become a lot more self-sufficient, and they wanted to kind of be able to develop their foods and any sort of technology without having to rely on neighbors as trading partners. The French, World War I in particular, has a profound effect on the French psyche. They realized that in this new nationalistic culture that the ways and the traditions that they'd embraced for centuries are under threat. And so they decide to start codifying their gastronomic heritage. Wine is naturally their primary interest, but Roquefort is the first cheese designated for AOC protection, and this is done prior to World War II. And if you're familiar with the Mons mixed milk cheese, 1924, that kind of gives you the time frame when they codified it to just be a sheep's milk cheese. Comté would be the next cheese that they would codify, but that wouldn't happen until after World War II. The English, on the other hand, they kind of hit a wall after World War I because so many of their young men that were part of the agrarian system were basically killed in mainland European battlefields, or they were sent off to further fortify the last vestiges of the empire. And then when World War II hit, this agricultural tradition was further eroded, and the agricultural sector just diminished. And this had been occurring for the past 100 some odd years, starting with the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And not only did wars and other worldwide events impact their ability to continue with an agrarian economy, there was just a drive by young men to move to the city and not work on the family farm. Also, attitudes about food changed pretty dramatically after both of these world wars, due in part to severe and strict rationing efforts that lasted well after the wars concluded, lasting until almost 1960. So, there's definitely a kind of food culture built around poverty and scarcity that is developed in England. With the exception of France and the establishment of INRA, a massive consolidation of the dairy industry all throughout Europe begins. But, the shining light that they do have in France, they do set up microbiology research labs. And in the 70s, they set up these regional labs so that they can study the different microbes in different regions. So there's one in Normandy to investigate camembert. There's one in the Franche-Comté where they'll investigate Comté, Roquefort, etc., Cantal, down the line. The Swiss, in turn, are actually developing proprietary microbes so that they can tell from almost the genetic level what whether their cheeses are legit and made in a traditional way. And the English are completely content to just carry on and abandon their microbial heritage for mass-produced cultures from countries like companies like Chris Hansen and Danisco. So that's Europe. What are we doing here in the United States? So the United States obviously is a mishmash of various cultures from successive waves of European colonization and settlement, including the Dutch, the English, Scandinavian, German, Italian, and Spanish. They all impart their own foodways and traditions into the American foodways. And with the 1850 success and adoption of the cheese factory model, this actually helps make the U.S. become a worldwide cheese superpower. Because of the abandonment of agrarian lifestyle in England, we were actually exporting cheddar cheese to England. So that was a pretty big development. However, we compromise our standing as a worldwide cheese superpower by skimming cream and filling the cheese. And this, in conjunction with the development of processed cheese, they kind of compromise our reputation in the global market. So for the most part, many American cheesemakers are using what are known as DVI or DVS freeze-dried cultures. That stands for direct vat inoculate or direct vat set cultures. And these can be either single strains or flavor blends that are primarily obtained from the European original sources. Almost every cheesemaker that I talked to when doing this research cited that high quality milk was the most important aspect for their operation. but sometimes cultures can be a bit of an afterthought. For example, Andy Hatch and Willie Lehner from Wisconsin, they're both very strong advocates for raw milk in a state that is very wary of raw milk, just because so much of Wisconsin's economy is tied up within the dairy industry. And both of these cheesemakers actually use very little amounts of cultures, so the raw milk that they do use can be the ultimate expression of the flavor. I remember when I asked Andy Hatch, he said it's just like a breath in the sails to kind of get the process going, and they're really allowing their milk and the raw milk microflora to do a lot of the work. But they do acknowledge that their peers in Wisconsin, which do work with pasteurized milk and do work with these very specialized cultures, they really recognize the talent that some of these cheesemakers have in terms of getting, exactly what a client is looking for in terms of acidity, moisture content, fat content, etc. And these are places like your Hen Eggs and your Sid Cook and Hook's cheddar cheese. You can hear the lightning. Apologies for that, but a little rainy here in Vermont. On the other end, well, not the other end of the spectrum, but somebody that I really admire is Sister Noella, who is a nun. She used to be at the Abbey of Regina Laudis in Bethlehem, Connecticut. She uses no commercial starters to make her cheese, a cheese called Bethlehem, which is based off of Saint Nectaire. She and her abbey of nuns actually went to the University of Connecticut for graduate school so that they could basically say with authority to the state of Connecticut's health and dairy inspectors that what they were doing was safe and traditional. So because they wanted to make raw milk using a wooden gerle, and a gerle is just basically, a wooden barrel, but because that barrel is porous, the state of Connecticut took issue with that. But she'll be the first to admit that she has had literally every kind of cheese making failure while making cheese. She's really doing it more to promote biodiversity rather than make a commercial product. But it's a highly sought after cheese. I've been fortunate enough to have it a couple of times, and it's very sour. If you've had like Saint Nectaire or Tom Crayus, especially ones that are a little long in the tooth, you kind of have an idea of what Bethlehem is like. And like I said, her primary interest is in fostering biodiversity. In a similar vein, you have Peter Dixon and Rachel Shaw, Parish Hill Creamery here in Vermont, down in Westminster West, and they make their own bulk starter cultures. And prior to DVI and DBS cultures, which are powdered, freeze-dried cultures, this was the way that the majority of cheesemakers were making cultures. They would basically take a mother culture, they'd inoculate it into milk, and they in turn would allow that to ferment overnight, and then they'd add it into their milk the next morning. And it's basically just another dairy product that you kind of have to keep tabs on and make sure is safe and doing what you need it to do as a cheesemaker. They decided that they were going to derive their starters from the milk of 4 different cows that had good health, they had good milk components, and udder disposition, and most importantly, had good taste associated with it. They feel that more cheese-making ingredients should be made locally. So in addition to the starter cultures, they do occasionally make their own rennet. They source their salt from Maine, which is the closest that they can get their salt from. And they think that not enough cheesemakers are familiar with the capabilities of what their starter cultures can do or can't do. And then in a whole other tier where we're taking it to a much more advanced level, Jasper Hill, who in turn are working with Ben Wolf at Tufts and Rachel Dutton at MIT. They're working with a staff microbiologist to isolate microbes that are unique to their land and cows and their aging facility. And I don't know if you recall, during the pandemic, they released like a camembert, a raw milk camembert using these microbes. They also have their native cultured Bailey Hazen that was derived from locally produced rye bread. And I just want to make it clear that many smaller and artisanal producers do not have their own staff microbiologists. This is a deliberate step and a position that Jasper Hill created so that they could really harness their taste of place. But most producers that do have staff scientists have them for QA and safety purposes mostly, as opposed to this kind of research. So, with this wide variety of ways that, cultures can be derived, how practical are native microbes here in the United States? And, this is a couple of years old, but, there has been a push to embrace native starter cultures, whether they be something that's more commercially harnessed or technologically harnessed, or kind of that harkens back to a pre-industrial age. So you do have the Bethlehem cheese, you have the Cornerstone from Parish Hill, you have this Jasper Hill Farm raw milk native cultured camembert. The 2019 edition of Cheese at Bra was devoted to cheeses made with native starter cultures from all over the world. And some of them are really good, some of them are fine. I think that one thing that we really need to embrace if we do want to engage with native starter cultures is there would be a lot more variability than we even have now with raw milk cheeses. So after all this study and research and a couple of years, these are the suggestions I have so that we can develop a better microbial ecology here in the United States and beyond. Begin by making your own bulk starter cultures. It is something that you can do. It does take a little bit more work, but it is completely accessible to a journeyman or journey person cheesemaker. We should really be investigating what the cheese industry's effect on microbial evolution are. And, not too long ago, there was an article about how there was basically a crossover event between Penicillium camemberti and Penicillium roqueforti, and they kind of created their own new strain. And while something like that is pretty innocuous and not harmful, we do need to think about how over-reliance on certain cultures could potentially lead to disastrous effects further down the road. How and where are cheeses aged? Not for nothing, a native, cave wooden board environment does promote a little bit of microbial diversity, and it's actually good for keeping things in check and keeping things healthy. If all fluid milk producers strive to improve milk quality, we can improve cheese. So many dairy farmers that have seen the diminishing returns on the price of their milk over the years have kind of given up on improving milk quality, and they are, just resigned to the fact that the milk that they do produce is ultimately going to be pasteurized and filtered so that they don't need to put any more effort in than they need to get their check from the co-op or DFA. If we focus on safety with mandatory HACCP plans and government certifications, as much as I dislike the idea of government overreach, there's only one state where you need to be certified to be a cheesemaker, and that's Wisconsin. All other 49 states, you just need to have a state-approved production facility and a milk handler's license, and away you go. And for the most part, it's not a big deal. I think more often than not, cheesemakers are going to do the right thing and going to produce safe, wholesome milk. But there's always situations where that does not always occur, and people get sick or people die. So if we do have a better understanding, and we have cheesemakers that have a more comprehensive knowledge of how all of the steps and practices that they employ impact the safety of their cheese, we could potentially be a little bit more experimental in the way that we either derive our cultures or produce our cheese. We need to engage with scientists and academic institutions to discuss harnessing local microbes to promote microbial diversity. The question whenever I do present this is, who's going to pay for it? Well, it takes a village, and if it's something that's important to you, get a group together, reach out to your legislators, and if you've got a progressive state with a responsive agricultural department, then it is possible. And the conclusions I developed is that there's no one perfect way to make an aged cheese. There's lots of ways to skin this cat, whether it is in a more traditional sense or whether it is more of a industrial way. I think that you can make great cheese while combining a lot of the modern benefits of safety and sanitation that we have. And the same can be said for aging. Not everything needs to be done on wooden boards. Some cheese can age just fine in a oxygen deprived environment, in plastic bags and in a box. The majority of lactic acid bacteria discovery has actually been done and has been done for about a century. But there are some new and interesting substrains that are still out there to be discovered, and they could be valuable for rind and flavor development. Cheese making, as I said, is much safer and more consistent than it has ever been. And something that is a little terrifying is, like, culture houses say that they have everything a cheesemaker would need, but they're only going to make it available to that cheesemaker if it's economically viable for them to produce, and they have enough people that are purchasing those cultures. One of the things that is actually in the crosshairs of becoming more and more more and more diluted is rennet. Rennet supplies are getting, and suppliers are getting, very tight, and if not enough people are using the strength of rennet you have, you're often told to get a stronger strength and dilute it. I was actually with Graham Kirkham of Kirkham's Lancashire the day that he got the call from his rennet supplier saying that they were no longer making the strength of rennet that he had been using for the past 15 years. And this is back in 2016. So he basically spent about a year tooling and fine-tuning his recipe to work with the new strength of rennet that he was given by his dairy supplier. An over-reliance on biotech can be stifling, and much more independent research is needed. A lot of the research that's being done in places like Switzerland, they're no longer being done at places like Agriscope, which are like a state-run organization. They're being done in private labs for companies like Emmy Roth, and they're keeping that information proprietary, and it's no longer public data, and has become patented microbial strains and other biotechnology. But the Swiss and the French, as I kind of alluded to, they know on a cellular level what make their cheeses unique, and why these microscopic organisms are important to their cheese making. And it'll take many, many years for us to develop our own microbiological heritage here in the United States. But the sooner we start, the sooner we can harness and access it. That is the presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it.